While the built-in jQuery effects can be nice, they can be limiting when you want to do very customized or specific animations. The Animate method in jQuery allows you to animate specific properties of any object in your HTML. These properties include any numeric CSS property. So if you can set a property in CSS, you can animate it with the Animate method in jQuery. The way the Animate method works is you can indicate the object you want to animate. In this case, something with the ID of book. Maybe this is a div tag, maybe this is a link. Using the Animate method, you pass it three things just like you can with the built-in basic effects. In this case, the first parameter is a list of the properties you want to animate. It looks a little complicated because of the curly braces, but that's a way that you can pass multiple properties as one parameter in this Animate method. So you'll see the opening curly brace, opacity, 0.25, so it's going to animate the opacity of that object to 0.25. It's going to animate the left property by 50 pixels, and it's going to animate the height property with a value of toggle. In other words, it's going to change the height from its smaller size to its larger size. The next parameter after the curly braces is 5,000. That's the duration. That'll be 5 seconds. The final parameter is that callback function that we saw with our built-in effects. It's the function that you want called when the animation is completed. Now, doing custom animations can sometimes be a lot of work, even if you're using jQuery, because the jQuery APIs are just the native APIs and sort of a baseline for what you can use. Utilizing third-party libraries can make animating easier, depending on what you're doing. For example, with easing, we have the ability to change the flow of how an animation works. jQuery has some easing functions, but there are additional easing functions that are available through third-party libraries. Same thing with stringing together animations. When you want one animation to happen after another one, jQuery can do this, but the delay plugin makes it easier to string animations together. Let's take a look at not only how we can apply easing, but also how we can create custom animations in our web applications. In this example, we're going to animate a scene. Objects animating after each other to kind of build this look in the web browser. Before we do the animation, I want to talk a little about easing. For people who don't come from an animation background, easing can sometimes be confusing because there are a lot of options. Easing is the way that an animation plays. I might tell an animation to play from an x value of 0 to an x value of 100. But easing will indicate how fast animation plays in the different parts of the entire animation. For example, linear easing, the upper left corner. If you watch this animation, it's a very consistent animation. It's playing the exact same speed from start to finish. So it animates up at the exact same speed and animates down at the exact same speed. Let's look at an extreme, like bounce. Notice the bounce animation will do the exact same type of animation, but the object bounces its way up and then bounces its way back down. The animation is playing the same distance. It's going from bottom to top and top to bottom, but it's just playing the animation differently. Let's look at an elastic example. Notice the animation will sort of rubber band at the top and rubber band at the bottom, sort of like it's elastic. So easing changes the way the animation plays. It might play slower at the beginning, faster at the end. It might play a bounce at the beginning or a bounce at the end. You'll notice many of these easing functions here have ease in or ease out. In simply means the easing occurs at the beginning of the animation. Out means it's at the end. So let's look at bounce again. If I test ease in bounce, notice the animation bounces at the beginning of each leg versus ease out bounce, which does the bounce at the end of the animation. Choosing an easing really depends on the look you want with your animation. Most of the time, the default easing is good enough to use for your animations. Back in the code, let's get these animations tied together. The first thing I want to do is have one of our elements show up. So we'll use one of the built-in effects to accomplish that. I'm going to use a $, and in quotes, pound sliders, angle bracket, star. This is a CSS shortcut or CSS selector to indicate that all elements inside of the sliders div tag that we have down below. So the angle bracket star will indicate any element inside that div tag with an ID of sliders. I'm going to tell them to show. Back in the browser, I'll refresh my landscape. And I'll see this background landscape show up. That's going to be one of the elements that will animate up. Before it animates up, however, I want that welcome title to fade out. Then I'll have my element animate up. So back in the code, I'm going to target that title text, and it has an ID of title bar, and I'll tell it to fade out. And I'll specify a duration of 1000. So that background graphic will show up and the title bar will fade out in 1 second. Let's test it. Back in the browser, I'll refresh, and I see that title text fade out immediately. The problem is I want it to stay on screen for a couple of seconds before it fades out. To accomplish that, I'm going to use the Jquery Delay method. Just before the fade out, I'm going to splice in a delay of 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are third-party libraries that make the delaying of animations a little bit easier. With Jquery, it can get a little bit verbose or have a lot of code. For basic effects, it's pretty easy. Once we get into animating other elements, you'll see how there's a little extra code involved. But for now, we'll see the title bar delay for 2 seconds and then fade out in 1 second. I'll save it, go back to the browser, and refresh. 2 seconds passes, my title text fades out. At this point, I want to trigger another effect to happen. The only difference is that this is a separate element. This is not the title text. If it were the title text that I want to animate, I could pretty easily chain the effect in line. I'll show you what I mean. After the fade out, I could have another delay of, say, 2 seconds, and then have it fade back in 1 second. Again, all these effects are being applied to the title bar, so it's really easy to do that in line. And just to show you in the browser what's happening, it waits 2 seconds, fades out, waits 2 more seconds, then fades back in. But as I said, I want to animate a different element, not just fade back in the same one. In order to do that, we need to create what's called a queue. In Jquery, we'll use the queue method to create a queue, and the way a queue works is it's really just a function that needs to be called. So I'll make a function inline. I'm going to pass a parameter to it called n. I'll describe what this is doing in a second. Opening curly brace, closing curly brace, and then I'll close down the Q function call. Think of this as sort of like a function within the animation that will get called after that last delay. Within this function, I'm going to animate that village moving up. To do that, I'll type $. I'll target something with a class of village. I'm going to tell it to animate using the Jquery Animate method. Remember, the way the Animate method works is we specify the properties we want to animate, and we can actually specify groups of properties to animate. So the first group, I'm going to specify a top of 30 pixels. In other words, I want the top to animate to 30 pixels. This animation, I'm going to tell it not to queue. I'm going to have a duration of 2000, and I want some easing to happen. So I'll specify some easing of ease, in, out, back. I spelled ease wrong, so I'll correct that. Ease, in, out, back. Now again, village is that div tag that's kind of in the background. It's going to animate up, and that animation is going to be 2 seconds. And it's going to have a little bit of easing both at the beginning, which is in, and at the end, which is out. The back describes the type of easing, and it simply means it's going to go past its endpoint and then come back a little bit. Using that easing chart I showed you earlier in the video will help you understand what that easing would do. Let's see how this works, and then we'll look at the code again. I'll save, go back to the browser, refresh, 2 seconds passes, we get a fade out, and then the village animates up. And notice how it kind of went down first, then moved up and kind of fell back into place. That was that back easing happening at the beginning and at the end. Let's look at this again. I'll refresh the browser, we'll see the title fade out, and the village will animate up, with back easing both at the beginning and at the end. Let's go back to the code and look at what's causing this all to happen again. Remember, the title bar waits 2 seconds. It then fades out, waits another 2 seconds, and then we'll do what's in the queue. The reason we had to use a queue is because the next animation was targeting a different element. We couldn't just chain it along with the other effects. We had to put it inside this queue in order for it to trigger. I'm going to add one more element inside the queue. I'll use $. I'll target the cloud bar this time. It's a little RSS feed widget that'll come down. It's going to animate its top to 0 pixels. It's not going to queue. The duration is going to be 2000 or 2 seconds, and its easing is going to be the same, ease, in, out, back. I'll go back to the browser, refresh, after the title bar fades out, both animations of the village and the cloud bar, or the RSS feed here, animate coming to their positions at the exact same time. Let's look at this again. Again, title fades out, and you'll see both of the animations occur at the exact same time. If I didn't want them to happen at the same time, I would have to have a cue chained in with that first animate line. So these cues might get nested quite deeply if you have animations that happen one after another, but they're pretty flexible. And as I said, using a third-party library to do some animation might allow you to animate things a little bit easier. If you're looking to do very complex animations, I recommend libraries like GreenSock or Create.js. They can be found at www.greensock.com or at www.createjs.com.